I, Gutoku Shinran, disciple of Shakyamuni, discarded sundry practices and took refuge in the primal vow in 1201. Namo Amida Butsu, 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 Namo Amida Butsu. So I'd like to continue with the adult message. Today I'd like to talk about what Shinran Shoni's life was and what he did in his contribution. So today is called Shuso Gotan-ye. That's the official kind of name. And Shuso literally means sect founder. And that's of course referring to Jodo Shinshu school of Buddhism. And Shinran Shonin was is considered its founder. So Gotan-ye means birthday, excuse me, gathering. Shinran's actual date of birth is said to be May 21st, 1173, and he passes away in 1263 at the age of 90 years old. So we have to remember that there is no electricity at this time yet. Glasses and bifocals are not invented yet. He did everything by hand under candlelight. So he's, writing everything like this, under the candlelight. And so it's astounding that he lived to the age that he did, especially compared to today's standards, right? Today we have medicine and the conveniences, but he didn't have any of those things at that time. So I think he was able to overcome many hardships because a lot of it had to do with his drive and his passion, or his, I don't know if passion would be the correct word, but his drive to spread the Buddha Dharma and the message of Amida Buddha's great compassion throughout the world. And that kind of drive will keep you going because you have the motivation to live. He was born in a place called Hino in Kyoto, and his first name was Matsuwaka Maro. In Japan, during these days, you go through different names in different phases of your life. So like in adolescence, he has a different name. And then in adulthood, early adulthood, he has another name. And then later adulthood, he has another name. And so that was common in Japan at this time. And I think another thing to remember about Shinran Shonin was similar to Shakyamuni Buddha, they both lose their mother at a very, very young age. So Shakyamuni's mother, Queen Maya, passes away almost soon after his birth. And Maya's sister, Mahaprajapati, takes care of him. And so he has a stepmother. But nevertheless, I think he starts to think about the loss of his nuclear mother, and I think that has a big impact on his kind of outlook. Similarly, Shinran Shonin loses both his parents, becomes an orphan by the time he was 9 years old, and then he's through his uncle's kind of guidance, he goes to Tokudo and goes to live in a monastery after that point. So 9 years old, he goes to a monastery. Can you imagine, at that age, the loneliness, I think, must have been immense, and kind of it must have really kind of made him think about what the meaning of life was, and became his drive to search for the meaning of life, both of these individuals. And so they both came to the realization of, I think, Amida Buddha's great compassion. And I think this world of compassion, or this message of compassion, kind of really fills this void, and it brings them a lot of comfort. And that is which drives them to spread this message. So Shinran Shonin lives for 20 years on this mountain called Mount Hiei, where he practices Tendai Buddhism, and he's unable to attain enlightenment, right? So at the age of 29, after 20 years of unsuccessful searching through rigorous practices and living in this monastery, he gives up his religious life and he comes down the mountain. He loses all hope in living. And again, we see another extremely traumatic experience taking place in his life, because the Buddhist world, or the being a monk, is all he knows, right? This is his entire identity, his entire well-being. And he realizes that it's not getting him to where he wants to go, which is free of suffering. And so he loses all hope in life, in living, in living. And so, lost and not knowing what to do, he goes to a place called Rokkakudo, which is in the city center of Kyoto. In that place, Rokkakudo still exists today. There's a Starbucks right next door to it. I went to it often. But yes, it's a very tiny place in the middle of the city of Kyoto, and it's still there. It still stands. And that's the really interesting thing about Kyoto. Just a little side note. There's all these hidden gems throughout that city. It's very fascinating. There is this one example that I can give. In the middle of a business district, there's all these like shopping places, like a udon place, and then there's like a pachinko yasan like down the street. There's like a department store, right? And then if you normally walk and you're not paying attention, you would pass this place. But there is this wooden slab that says, "This is where Sakamoto Ryoma was assassinated." And he's a huge figure in Japanese history, right? He was very momentous during the whole Meiji period, during the whole transition of Japan's transition from feudal Japan to modern Japan. So Sakamoto Ryoma is assassinated in this inn, right? And there's a wooden slab that kind of not commemorates that, but shows that's the location. And so you would pass it if you had no idea what that was. But there's all these hidden gems in this city. So I definitely recommend going to Kyoto if you haven't had a chance. You're kind of literally walking on sacred ground there. It's an amazing place. But anyway, I digress. Shinan was led to the path of Nembutsu by his teacher, Honen Shonin, and who found the way to attainment of Buddhahood through the wisdom and compassion of Amida Buddha. And what Shinan eventually came to understand was that all this time he was trying to search for truth, right? He was trying to rank up in the levels of Buddhism, right? And he was searching and searching and searching. And in the end, he only hit a glass ceiling. He was unable to go past that. He was unable to attain enlightenment. But under the guidance of his spiritual teacher, Honen, he came to understand that truth was not something that you strive for to try to gain, right? In fact, the harder he tried, the further away he felt from getting to enlightenment, right? So instead, he was forced to change his entire thinking and worldview about religion. He realized that truth wasn't something to try and constantly reach for, right, and try to gain, right? But instead, truth was always right at his feet, right? He just had to awaken to that understanding. Truth is not something we try to attain. In other words, we don't try to control it. It's not a trophy or a medal that we can wear on ourselves and say, I understand it. I get truth. You are not as smart as me. You don't have the patience and the wisdom that I do. I went through the work to get this, right? And that's the way a lot of times, unfortunately, religious people will treat truth, will treat religion, right, as a badge to wear. But that's not correct. If you think about it, that is such a selfish way to see the world and to understand religion in this way. Instead, Shinan understood that truth is available to everyone. It has to involve everyone, actually, because otherwise it wouldn't be a universal teaching. Truth is not a trophy, right? Truth has nothing to do with you, actually. Yet it has everything to do with you. And that's the very kind of intriguing thing about religion. It embraces you just as you are. And this is what Shinran Shonin came to realize. Honen Shonin showed him this truth that we call, as Jodo Shinshu Buddhists, we call this truth Amida Buddha's great compassion. And this is the truth that embraces Shinran Shonin and his own Bonbu self, the ignorant being of blind passions. Now, Shinran becomes fully aware of the Nimbutsu teaching and spends the rest of his life trying to spread the message of the Nimbutsu teaching throughout Japan. And that's why at the beginning of this Dharma talk, I stated the following quote, I, Gutoku Shinran, disciple of Shakyamuni, discarded sundry practices and took refuge in the primal vow. Sundry practices here means the practice to try and attain enlightenment through one's own self-power. We call it jiriki. And instead of jiriki, he turns over to other power, tariki, which is the primal vow. So this conversion is encapsulated in the statement that I just read. So eventually the Nembutsu movement started by Honen Shonin, becomes popular, very popular. It starts to take off in Japan. So much so that the Tendai monastery of Mount Hiei, the Shingon school of Mount Koya, and the Nara schools of Buddhism, the powers that be at that time, the status quo, began to complain. And they started to disparage this new school of Buddhism, right? And so they appeal to the government, they make a grievance to the government, and the government then seeks to persecute and quell this Nembutsu movement. Honen Shonin and his chief disciples were either executed or exiled to different parts of Japan. And so Shinran Shonin was exiled, and he got sent to this place called Echigo, which is in present-day Niigata, Niigata prefecture, right? Very famous for its rice, right? And its sake. Anyway, it's northeast of Kyoto. So, but instead of living in seclusion and ashamed, right? Instead of that, Shinran took the opportunity to propagate and spread the Nembutsu teaching. And as a matter of fact, what he ended up doing was spreading what the government did not intend this, but what happened was the Nembutsu movement spread through these different regions of Niigata, and then Shinran Shonin also makes his way to the Kanto region east of Kyoto. And the Kanto region includes Tokyo, right, the capital, which is the capital today. But at that time, it was a rural area. And so Shinran Shonin spreads the Nembutsu teaching to the rural areas and the common folk, and gains a huge following himself, right? And these people were to become his most avid followers later on, well after his death. So eventually he was pardoned and he returned back to Kyoto, where then he started to write a bunch of different works. And one of them was called the Kyogyo Shinsho, which I read today during a lot of these Dharma talks. So until the age of 90, Shinran lived humbly and simply. And one important contribution, the last thing I kind of want to talk about today, was that he opened up the path of Buddhahood to all beings, not just a select few, right? In his day and age, you had to be either super duper smart, a super scholar monk, or super duper capable in terms of your physical capabilities. You had to be a borderline Olympian in those times to be able to do the practices that were required of you. I mean, how many times do you have to circumambulate the statue of the Buddha, or do these rigorous practices, waking up at the crack of dawn and doing chanting sutras, memorizing sutras and commentaries and these things, right? So the practices were very rigorous during Shinran's time. But what Shinran was able to do through his understanding was to say that it's not just for these select few. Buddhism, in its true intent and its truth, is to be for all people. It's to be for the people who cannot do those practices. And all those people are still embraced within Amida Buddha's great compassion. So he literally brings Buddhism down from the Mount Hiei to the common folk and to the rest of Japan. And that was his great contribution. In this way, Amida Buddha's great compassion is the universal truth that is not only for the select few to understand, it is for all people. And without him, Buddhism would not be what it is today. Without Shinran's guidance, only the scholar monks or the monks who are in peak physical condition would be able to understand this teaching. So it's for this reason that we gather today to observe and celebrate Shinran Shonin's birthday, Gotan-ye. It is for this reason that we put our hands together in Gassho for the founder of our school of Buddhism and for his guidance that still works on us 800 years after his death, right? 800 years, and in a completely different part of the world as well. And so for that, we put our hands together in Gassho. And with that, I would like to end today's message. Thank you very much. Please join me in Gassho. I, Gutoku Shinran, disciple of Shakyamuni, discarded sundry practices and took refuge in the primal vow in 1201. Namo Amida Butsu. 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 Thank you very much.